Now that you've gotten a taste of dark romanticism, we are taking it one step further and looking at the American Gothic tradition and the iconic Edgar Allan Poe. Now, in some cases, in some literature, you will read dark romanticism and American Gothicism used interchangeably as sort of the same thing. And there's some validity to that. However, in this course, we make the distinction between the two because there really are qualities that separate American Gothicism specifically as a subgenre of the dark romantic movement. So, dark romanticism involves these ideas of good and evil, that man is prone to self destruction, the nature of judgment, guilt, punishment, sin. Those sorts of things are very entrenched in dark romantic ideology. However, in the Gothic tradition, we have a much more distinct characteristic that we're looking at. So, in the Gothic tradition, we are largely looking at qualities, terror, fear. These are things that sort of motivate the Gothic tradition. Um, Edgar Allan Poe, who is sort of the godfather of American Gothic genre, um, it could be argued that he has influenced essentially every Gothic subculture since his existence. I mean, the ideas of not just horror films, but suspense, thriller, mystery, these sorts of things that build on our tension and our fear or anxiety about things. Uh, that is all tied back to American Gothicism. I also think it's really important to distinguish between what is the American Gothic tradition and what is the larger Gothic tradition in literature, or just the idea of Goth or Gothic in pop culture. So when you think of Gothic or Goth, you probably think of an aesthetic, and certain ideas might come to mind, and those are certainly born out of the same traditions. However, when it comes to literature, Gothicism is very different. It encompasses different things. And British Gothic tradition is very different than American Gothic tradition. So the British Gothic tradition, think of things like Frankenstein or Dracula or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? These sort of classic spooky stories that oftentimes involve sort of monsters or the supernatural. They often involve, castles and haunted mansions and these very storied traditions that were possible in the English, British English tradition because they've been around for centuries, a lot of history to build on. But in the American Gothic tradition, remember, we hadn't been here that long, and we had only been a nation at this point for less than 100 years. So we really didn't have those things to build our tradition upon. So what American Gothicism does is it takes that tradition of Gothicism in British literature and applies it to what we had in the States. And what we had was a lot of internal turmoil, a lot of personal torment, and things that people were concerned about is what permeates the American Gothic tradition. So you often see things like madness or insanity come up in American Gothic tradition. And I think a concise analogy is that British Gothicism is about the supernatural monsters, but American Gothicism is about the monsters in our own mind. And there is no greater example of this than Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe is probably one of the most influential authors in American literature. And he often has this reputation as sort of a brooding, angsty, dark, sort of spooky character. And he is those things, but he is also so much more. Edgar Allan Poe is largely credited with the tradition of short stories in American literature. He literally wrote the book on what a short story should be. He founded the idea of unity of effect, which is a foundation of short stories, the idea that every single word in a story should all point to the same similar effect. He invented detective novels and is largely responsible for the mystery genre. He was a essayist, he was a critic, he was a lecturer, he was all these other things, but he was also, the sort of king of the spooky story in his life. So Edgar Allan Poe was born in 1809 in Baltimore, Maryland. His parents were married at the time of his birth. He did have an older brother and a younger sister. Within a year of his life, his father abandoned the family. His father had been a colonel, or he had been some sort of ranking officer in the Revolutionary Army. And his mother died in 1811. So within 2 years of his life, he's effectively orphaned. His siblings were split up to go live with various relatives. His brother went to live with his grandparents, sister went to live with like a cousin, and he went to go live with the Allens, who were his aunt and uncle. So his name, Edgar Allan Poe, Allan is not his middle name. It's actually a surname that he took on, although the Allens never adopted him. So the Allens were John and Frances, um, and by all accounts, Frances, the mother or the wife in this family, his aunt, was a mother figure to him. He called her Ma, and he later wrote after her death that she treated him as her own throughout his entire life. She was not able to have kids of her own. John Allen, however, did not get along with Edgar Allan Poe in very dramatic and well documented ways. They butted heads their whole life. Um, John Allen disinherited Poe after the death of Frances. There was a lot of conflict between the two of them. So already you can see in his original parents and his aunt and uncle that raised him, he has this sort of attachment to a mother figure, and he has a very troubled relationship with a father figure. Now, when he was 14, he did sort of become infatuated with a friend of his mother, and she died. Then he eventually, he leaves, he joins the army, and while he is, away in the army, catches wind that Frances, his mother figure, is dying. She had been ill for a very long time, and so he comes home, leaves, and comes to be with her, and she dies 2 days before he comes back. She was actually buried the day before he arrived, so he not only didn't get to see her before she passed, he also missed the burial. He wrote about this as well. Now, if you're keeping track, that is now 3 women in Poe's life who have died, all in their 20s, all of what is assumed to be tuberculosis. Now, after this, Edgar Allan Poe goes to West Point. For a period of time after he sort of resigns from the army, the whole thing. While he's at West Point, he basically he refuses to go to classes or church seminars or anything like that. He eventually gets kicked out of West Point, and he goes to live with another aunt, Maria Clem, and this is where he meets his future wife, who was his cousin. She was also 13 when they met, Virginia. Now, this is the part of sort of Poe's lifetime that when is brought up to people, they immediately recoil, and I completely understand why. However, I do think that it's important to point out during this period of time, it was number one, not unusual to marry your cousin, and number two, not unusual to marry girls that had just undergone puberty. 14, 15, that was very normal for, which is not to defend it. It is, of course, reprehensible, but culturally speaking, Poe was no different than any other upper middle class man. Um, as well, I will just point this out. There is much speculation as to whether their marriage was ever consummated. Most people believe it was not. And there are actually many biographers who would argue that Poe never had a sexual relationship in his lifetime. But that's another story. Now, he marries Virginia, and by all accounts, he is desperately in love with her. And they are married for 9 years until she dies at the age of 24 of tuberculosis. So if you're keeping track, that is now 4 women in his life who have died very young and suddenly from tuberculosis. So Poe's life is sort of plagued by loss and tragedy. And in his short stories, you really see this, his life come to be. Oftentimes we have a character who is insane or psychologically tormented in some way. That is a male character. And then we have female characters who are usually dead or dying. And you'll see that in both of the pieces you're reading from Poe. After his wife's death, he did remarry, but he had, a troubled adulthood as well. He struggled with alcoholism and opiate addiction, and in 1849, he was found wandering the streets of Baltimore wearing somebody else's clothes and was incoherent. And 2 days later, he died. cause of his death is still a great mystery. Some believe that he was the target of organized crime. Some people believe it was just alcoholism or tuberculosis. Some people suggest rabies. Some people suggest that he was the victim of, it was an election day, was the day he was found, that he was a victim of an election day crime. All sorts of crazy stories about the way that he passed away. But, although he is this sort of mythic and incredibly influential author, his life was really plagued by tragedy, and that informs the fear and anxiety and terror that you see in his stories. So American Gothicism is concerned with the monsters of our mind. And what makes monsters in our mind? Well, the things that we're scared of. Well, what were people scared of at the time? Death and dying, of course. That was one of the things that people were concerned about. And also live burial was something that happened way more often than it should during this period. They didn't have great medical science. They didn't have great medical examination. Coffins were actually built with fail-safes, bells, so that if people were buried alive, they could, let somebody know. So that was something that people were concerned about. Um, and these are things to pay attention to. Also, just the idea of madness and insanity. This is the period of history with asylums where we didn't really understand insanity or madness. Not that those are, terms we would use today anyway, but they didn't understand them then, and they were very fearful of what could sort of make a person's mind break. So watch out for that in these two stories. If you're reading The Raven, which is probably the most famous American poem of all time, one of them at least, which is the first thing that you'll be reading. I'll also be including a audio version of James Earl Jones reading it. James Earl Jones is the voice of Mufasa and Darth Vader, so it's an exceptional reading. I encourage you to listen to it. And then you'll be reading The Black Cat, which is uh, a very classic Poe story told from the point of view of a narrator who is questionably sane, who becomes obsessed with this cat and lashes out at his wife in very tried and true Poe fashion. Something to be thinking about in The Black Cat and in The Raven. Are this narrator to the speaker, are they insane? Do they know whether they're insane or not? And what sort of ideas is Poe pointing us to beyond just those notions of fear and terror that permeate the American Gothic tradition? I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this one.